In November of 2012, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed dropped to a positive critical and fan reception. Some considered it a contender with Mario Kart, while others would argue that, at the time, it may have even surpassed it. Transformed unfortunately had its fair share of bugs, some of which were sorted, but many that, even now, haven't been. Fast forward to today, where after a healthy delay, we now have Team Sonic Racing. Gone are the transforming vehicles and colorful Sega cast, instead replaced with Sonic mainstays and a focus on cooperative gameplay. And while in a few areas, Team Sonic Racing feels like a step or two towards improvement, it takes several flights worth of stairs tumbling backwards. Now up front, this review is all about the Switch version of the game. That means, yes, the graphics and frame rate have taken a hit. While still, certain textures, namely light reflections and shadows, are lower than the other console and PC counterparts. But while in motion, you won't notice these things, and at no point did I feel like I was missing out on anything visually. In fact, the game looks quite nice in handheld mode, which is arguably the reason you'd shell out for the Switch version in the first place. Tracks are vibrant, though lack variety. There's essentially 7 themes, or zones, and many of the courses under each banner don't do much to differentiate themselves from one another. There is the rooftop run set of stages that actually feel different from one another, but then you've got Planet Wisp and Seaside Hill, for instance, where the 3 tracks featured are painfully similar in look and feel between them. What's on display is nice, but more variety among the tracks would have helped this game tremendously. Still, the carts and characters look nice, and what's here is, at least, very pretty. And yes, we'll get the elephant out of the room now. Team Sonic Racing does run at 30 frames per second on the Switch. In my opinion, if you don't play any other version with 60 FPS, you aren't going to really care. At no point did I feel like the frame rate was an issue with the gameplay. We'll get to that soon enough. And TSR manages to keep a consistent 30 frames per second while racing. There's only one spot that the game does consistently and noticeably drop, and that's when activating your ultimate. Every single time, the game chugs for just a moment as the animation plays, which the animation itself is fairly distracting and you'll notice the drop in frames. Other than that though, it runs as it should. So unless you're some psycho that has to have 2 copies of this game, 30 frames per second gets the job done. The soundtrack is the highlight of TSR, as music typically is even in the worst of Sonic titles. There's plenty of remixes of old songs and it feels like this was the area that saw the most fan service. Rooftop Run and Sandopolis are my 2 personal highlights, though the game's theme song, Greenlight Ride, falls a bit short. Something about it lacks the usual energy that the beloved guilty pleasure butt rock Crush 40 plays normally has. The chorus never quite hits its stride and altogether it feels oddly off. Speaking of off, Team Sonic Racing features its characters talking to one another. A lot. During races. To give the game some personality and to, I guess, mix together characters that might not normally interact with one another, every character is chatting constantly, obnoxiously throughout the races. Sometimes this is your teammates crying for help, but oftentimes it's them reacting to things you don't see because you're racing your kart, not theirs. Thankfully, you can shut these off, and as you can tell with the majority of this footage, I did. That's not to imply the voice acting is bad, really. In fact, most of it's pretty good throughout the game's story, which is a surprisingly entertaining and thoroughly enjoyable little tale. What's remarkable is, for once, the majority of the cast acts like the manuals and character bios always claim they do, but as an audience, we rarely ever see. Sonic himself cares more about racing his friends than actually investigating anything suspicious, while the rest of the characters conspire with one another about what's going on around them. Although most of the voice acting is great, Eggman is a highlight as always, and Silver is actually enjoyable as your socially awkward friend that you never take to parties. Knuckles, Shadow, and Rouge are pretty poor. The game did see a lot of shakeups in the cast, so this could very well be new members adjusting to their roles, but in their first outing, they're notable outliers. So like we talked about at the top, Team Sonic Racing sticks solely to kart racing with a team gimmick. Now the idea of making a racer where you need to rely on 2 other racers, 2 AI racers no less if you're playing alone, doesn't exactly sound fun to me, and unfortunately in practice it largely isn't. Like a normal kart racer, TSR has you race 3 laps, use items to ward off your opponents, and aim for first place. Now if you're like me, getting first or at least close to it is a pretty simple affair. But Team Sonic Racing's team system throws a whole new wrench into things. Throughout the game, you're able to give your partners items, as well as a special boost called slingshotting if they, or you, follow the path of the person in the highest place on your team. This makes staying in the race as a human being very simple, and these team actions help build your ultimate gauge. Your ultimate functions as a huge temporary boost with invincibility. Hitting it at the same time as your partners will net everyone a slightly longer boost, and that's quite literally the only time the AI is useful. Otherwise, you're basically doing one thing while racing. Babysitting. TSR's story has you saddled with 2 AI characters, except in certain challenges, which aren't really that remarkable and unfortunately do feel like a step down from the career mode in Transform. You never once get to pick your AI characters, instead being tied to the respective team the character is supposedly a part of. This even extends to the Grand Prix modes, which, as far as I could tell, you only get Tails and Knuckles on your team when you're playing alone. While I get it in the story, it's insanely lame that modes outside of it do not let you choose your partners. Not that it matters though, as no matter who the racer is, the AI is just awful. While I could fight my way to the front pretty quick, I found that computer players were always falling behind. It was only through constantly feeding them any and all items I'd pick up that they'd slowly start going back up the ranks. Ultimates are the only reliable cure, as they almost seem to rubber band themselves close to you once it's been fired. But they don't stick around for long and it's right back to babysitting for you. Now, there's 2 common cover-ups that I've been told about for these things. The first is racing with other people. Well, I can safely say that the little bit of time I played online in TSR made no difference. Part of that was because I could never fill a whole room with people on the Switch version, so there's always at least one AI partner anyway. And you know what? These faceless mole people didn't play much better. It was at this point I bummed a copy through Steam's shared library to get the full experience of playing the game with friends, hoping it might make a difference. Sadly, it didn't. While my team was now smart enough to know whether they could drive in the grass or not and how to use the slingshot system for more than a millisecond, the overall experience just doesn't feel fluid. The co-op element somehow feels forced and hollow, almost as if it exists to have a gimmick that sets it apart from being just another kart racer with Sonic's mug slapped on the front. The other cover-up exposes another issue, and that's solo races. You'd think that being able to play this game alone and focus on racing would alleviate a lot of my complaints with this game, but it doesn't really. Instead, without it, you realize how boring and empty most of these tracks are. They're designed, to a very basic degree I might add, around the way teams are supposed to operate. The majority of the tracks feature huge, empty roads with a handful of obstacles that are clearly intended to be shared together. So, if you're good and you pull ahead of the pack, there's not much to look forward to. There is the occasional loop or ramp to break up the monotony, but at no point does it reach the level of its competitors or even the game's own predecessor. Ironically, the tracks in the game that do break the mold are returning from the series, like Ocean View and Seaside Hill. The worst part of Team Sonic Racing is that there's a hugely competent racer buried under here. The biggest complaint I have about Transformed is its finicky trick system, where you use the right analog stick to perform flips before landing, which leads to a boost. In Transform, the game had issues with hit detection occasionally, causing stunts to fail for seemingly no reason. Thus, you have to be cautious as to when and where you use them. In TSR, that's completely fixed. I never once felt like the game ripped me off if a stunt failed. It was because I took an unchecked risk. The drifting feels better than ever, and every single kart handles fantastic. Each race nets you credits you can use to unlock various parts for different characters, which there's a huge variety of. You can also customize horns, colors, and add different decals for every racer's car. There's also some variety between each racer as well, with speed, technique, and power types. They all change the way you play the game, and, well, they absolutely should. The trouble is, the tracks featured aren't conducive to displaying your racer's talent, instead opting to focus on the team gameplay. The game seems light on content on the surface, and with only 15 racers and 21 tracks, compared to most modern racers, it is. But underneath is a pretty robust little customization system, which you'd think they'd maybe tout a little more. That said, I never felt the need to mess with it much, and since the tracks featured don't exactly make a point of making any of this matter, it's hard to care. And at the end of the day, that's the real problem. The tracks aren't great, sure, but it's the core idea of this game I just couldn't get behind. As someone who loved Transformed and all the fan service that came with it, I really hope Team Sonic Racing would be a slam dunk. There is a good game in here somewhere, it's just utilized so poorly. Team Sonic Racing isn't the worst racer you can pick up, but when you look at what's available now, or maybe even what's coming in a month's time, it's a tough case to recommend it.